Good morning, Wabash. Today, speaking at Pioneer Chapel is Dr. Derek Nelson. Derek is professor of religion and Stephen S. Bowen, professor of liberal arts at Wabash. He also directs the Wabash Pastoral Leadership Program, a Lilly Endowment-funded program for leaders of Indiana congregations. A 1999 graduate of Wabash, Nelson lives in Crawfordsville with his wife Kelly and daughter Madeline. Some of his interests lend themselves well to sheltering in place, like reading, writing, and woodworking, while others do not, like traveling and throwing parties. He is currently teaching a class on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whose work of resistance against the Third Reich inspired this chapel talk. Without further ado, Derek Nelson and his talk, Life Together, Apart.
Well, many thanks to the Sphinx Club for their recorded yelling that you should be here, to Dean Feller for the invitation, and to Sports Information Director and Honorary Alumnus Brent Harris for that intro that rings so true, it's as if I wrote it myself. Thanks also to all viewers tuning in across the country. I do feel compelled to say that probably my least favorite thing in the universe, besides human suffering and the clarinet, is TV news, which this kind of feels like. So I'll try not to look at the camera too often to keep this from being a news anchor monologue. At the outset, I think we ought to just say that this is probably a little bit weird. Weird for me, weird for you. It's worse than that for some of us. I'm so sad for seniors who won't get to have the lovely in-person May festivities, for spring athletes with unused eligibility, for people whose home situation makes trying to learn next to impossible, and really for all of Wabash. You're trying to make the best of a very hard situation, and I'm so proud of you for what you're doing. I think it's important in a time of weirdness or even of crisis to have a rhythm, to develop a ritual even. I hope all of the students are developing some kind of ritual wherein every day, preferably before their first of many Zoom calls, you put some pants on. Aim low and then reach those goals. So it's Thursday, it's about 11, and so here we are in the chapel. It's a small, good thing. When I was asked to speak today, I suppose it was inevitable that I would be doing something like a religious interpretation of the meaning of this whole COVID-19 pandemic. So let me ask you this. What religious word would come to mind if someone told you a year ago that the following three things would all be true on April 2nd, 2020? First, Professor Kubiak had abandoned all in-person teaching of Greek in favor of electronic platforms. 2, all Wabash students had taken a very keen interest in personal hygiene. And 3, servings of bacon consumed in Sparks had plummeted to 0. The word you're looking for is apocalypse. Or other possibilities exist. What if at the end of all this, we had millions of people who had not cut their hair in months, hadn't been to the dentist, and basically had their yoga pants fused to their skin? What would be needed in that case, religiously speaking, is an exorcism. But the word I want to focus on is a different one. That word is community. Community. I tend to be someone who looks to history, and even more basically to stories, for help when I don't know or don't understand what's happening. So most of what I want to do today is simply tell a story in this chapel talk, a story from about 85 years ago. I think you'll appreciate the story, which is very dramatic. In fact, it's even kind of shocking. I'll start to make some connections, maybe draw some lessons, or at least suggest some guidelines for what it means in our context, but I'll leave the rest of that up to you. You tell me what you make of this story. This is thick description. That's a term in social science where you don't just describe what's happening, but the context in which it's happening too, so that people who listen to the description can see things that the describer even may have missed. And that definition is from Dr. Blix, not from Wikipedia, so you can take it to the bank. The story is about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his brief time with seminarians at a place called Finkenwalde. Bonhoeffer was one of the most important theologians of the 20th century. He would have been even greater had he not died at the tender age of 39. I say died, but that's not really right. He was executed by the Nazis just days before the end of World War II. Despite being imprisoned for the last years of his life, in his short career he wrote an immense amount, beginning with a dissertation that he finished at the age of 21, having taken a couple months to write it. He was a truly remarkable man, and his death is a scandal and a tragedy. After getting his doctorate at that young age, he ran into a problem. A rarely enforced German law forbids the granting of a professorship to anyone under 25. I don't think that happens very often. Not an issue because, college takes us mere mortals a while. And then there's master's degrees and PhDs and the rest. So to kill some time, Dietrich went off to New York City to study at Union Seminary, which was kind of hilarious because he was 10 times smarter than his professors. I'm sure you Wabash students know nothing about that. He went to Barcelona, where he served as a pastor for a while, and then to England, and for a while he worked with the youth movement in Berlin. And he was very active in the church struggle against the Nazis. Some Germans, who called themselves German Christians, claimed it was their patriotic and even their Christian duty to support their leader, the Führer, no matter what, with blind devotion. Bonhoeffer and millions of others disagreed. They formed a new organization called the Confessing Church. Its basic document was the Barmen Declaration, which said, in effect, Jesus is Lord and Adolf Hitler isn't. The Confessing Church was barely legal and was run on a shoestring budget. It had a lot of people cheering it on from the outside, though, and Bonhoeffer was a prolific letter writer, asking for support and trying to tell the story of how the church's resistance to Hitler was going. The need for training pastors to serve in this church was clear, and so a seminary was formed. Actually, there were 5, but the famous one was on the North Sea in modern-day Poland, then Pomerania, called Finkenwalde, and it started in 1935. This was a grand experiment in education. Only a classically trained, frankly genius mind like Bonhoeffer would have the credibility to say, screw the university, we're not doing things that way anymore. He wanted to do something very different at Finkenwalde. The old model had been that students listened to lectures and took tests after they felt like they had heard enough that they might actually pass the exam. Bonhoeffer thought that might be fine for a previous century. Earlier times maybe called for competent leaders, ones who knew the basics and who could do the basics well. But already in 1935, Bonhoeffer was thinking about what kind of leader would be needed in the post-war years. Before the war even started, he knew it was coming and was thinking about what kind of person it would take, what kinds of skills and personal characteristics and integrity and strength of spirit would it take to be a leader after the war. Bonhoeffer loved his country, but he hoped Germany would lose and would do so quickly. He later joined the military intelligence agency called the Abwehr and actively sought to undermine Germany's war effort. He participated in a plot to kill Hitler. This plot was the basis for the movie Valkyrie, incidentally, but I am glad to say that Tom Cruise did not portray Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So think about this. It's 1935. It's crisis time in Germany. All hands on deck, crisis. Every thought is of the coming war. What's Hitler going to do next? And Bonhoeffer's thinking way ahead. He's thinking, what kind of person can heal this nation when this crisis is over? Families will be torn, with some having supported the Third Reich and others not. Shame and guilt will abound. Anger and resentment too. Only a person who truly knows himself or herself, who is intimately connected to and supported by a large network of cooperators and deep, deep friends, only they will be able to mediate. It takes enormous courage and laser-focused centeredness to be able to stand in the ruins of a devastated nation and to work to repair, to build things back up, instead of pointing fingers of blame or sulking in the corner, ashamed and upset. So Bonhoeffer proposed a different model for a seminary. It was focused on three things: communal worship and prayer, academic study, and devotional Bible reading. This was really different from how seminaries had trained pastors earlier. There were about 50 students living in the seminary, and they met every morning at dawn for prayers and singing. There was a calendar of appointed readings that they should gradually work through. They confessed their sins to each other in small groups, not just you and the priest and a little awkwardness, but in a group of 5 or 6. Each was brutally honest with the others about how things were going with his soul. Then the brothers departed and went their separate ways for work and study. There were some lectures, but mostly it was directed reading, some writing of short papers for discussion, and one-on-one conversations with teachers and other students. Already a renowned theological genius, Bonhoeffer was supposed to be called Herr Direktor, Mr. Director, but he preferred to be called Bruder Dietrich, Brother Dietrich. They took turns cooking, cleaning up, and organizing social activities. Mostly these were hikes, but the occasional party or cultural outing happened too. A small staff was on hand to make sure daily life was taken care of, but to a large degree the brothers did it themselves. After their studies and fun were over, they gathered again for evening prayer, a time of sharing and some more singing. Then it was off to bed to do it again the next day. It sounds quite simple. In a way, it maybe sounds kind of charming, if you can get over how boring it might have been. But to a person, everyone who has spoken of his experience at Finkenwalde speaks of it as the greatest and most impactful time of his life. Why? It was a true community. Some rules that Bonhoeffer insisted on probably helped. One of them was that no brother was allowed to speak of another brother unless he was present. Think about how hard that would be. What if a Wabash fraternity adopted that rule? What would happen to faculty gossip? How quickly we would learn to control our desire for gossip, for harmful venting. We might choose the path of uncomfortable honesty, even if it meant confrontation. It's a very powerful rule. And shout out here to Seth Burrish, Parker Knoll, Jake Vermeulen, and Mark Castor, who have been reading Bonhoeffer with me the last few weeks and helped me to see the power of that practice. Another rule, which actually seems quite strange to me, was that during all this singing, only singing in unison was permitted. Bonhoeffer was weirdly insistent about this. Partly it seems that he thought people would become too prideful if their bass line was really smoking, or if that descant on verse 3 really, really hit home. But deeper than that, I think, was the need to truly listen to each other. It's harder to sing in unison than in parts, really. If you're singing in parts, there's a lot going on, and so if you make a few mistakes, it's unlikely to really show through. But if 59 of the 60 students are singing a B flat on a certain vowel and one's not, it's a problem. There were other rules as well, but I just highlight those two. So things were going very well at Finkenwalde. Then, for about 2 years. Then in November of 1937, at dawn and without warning, the Gestapo came. That's the Nazi secret police. They arrested 27 brothers and sent them to prison. They collected the tables and desks, smashed them, and burned the pieces in a bonfire. Before there could be a graduation ceremony, before people could say goodbye, the whole place was disbanded. The students who had escaped being arrested went home to what felt like a prison anyway. They felt lost, confused, scared, and alone. If it wasn't obvious before, it probably is now why Finkenwalde has been on my mind so much recently. I think Bonhoeffer had been away from campus when the Gestapo came. He didn't know what to do. Who would? This was not something with much precedent. Partly his response was writing. He wrote letters to every single student. He wrote a devotional booklet that included the readings that they would have done in the morning and evening prayer for the upcoming Christmas season. But the main thing he did was to write a book called Life Together. Life Together became a bestseller. He wanted to keep alive the spirit of the community of Finkenwalde, as the brothers had to live apart. And he kept thinking about this idea of leadership. Who will be able to lead after the crisis has torn everything apart? So I think about you, Wabash, and I think about Bonhoeffer's two questions. How do we keep the spirit of community alive? And what kind of person could possibly lead in the aftermath of this crisis? I intended this to be a short chapel talk, and I've already said more than I planned to, but let me close by answering Bonhoeffer's questions in three ways. These are drawn from this book, Life Together, which I strongly recommend, a lovely book, as he struggled with what to say to a community that was painfully disbanded and spread apart. First, he insists that community is a gift, not an achievement. It's a gift. It happens. You can strive for it and work for it and think about it, but when it happens because it happens, and not because you strove, worked, or thought. I've been thinking about this a lot as we've undergone this weird disruption in these last weeks. What I miss about our community is the chance encounter, the sidebar conversation, the casual insight shared over a meal or over coffee. Those things matter a lot because each of you at Wabash matters a lot. And that's not to say that we can't continue them. I say continue to receive them, and it's important to say receive rather than do them, because community happens. It's not done. As much as modern persons want to be autonomous agents who secure their own existence and chart their own course, this pandemic has laughed its fool head off at that myth. Bonhoeffer helps us to see that we need each other, that we are made for each other, and in receiving the other as brother and sister, that's where we find ourselves. Community is not an ideal to be realized by working really hard to make it realer. It's a reality already that might be graciously uncovered and revealed to us. You still have to strive for it, but it comes on its own terms. Second, Bonhoeffer helps us to see how quickly we make an idolatry of community. The people who loved Finkenwalde missed it and were prone to romanticizing it. Bonhoeffer says no to this tendency. Allow me to quote just a bit. Those who love their dream of a Christian community more than the Christian community itself become destroyers of that community, even though their personal intentions may be ever so honest, earnest, and sacrificial. God hates this wishful dreaming because it makes the dreamer proud and pretentious. The bright day of community dawns wherever this early morning mists of dreamy vision is lifting. What this harsh word means to me in the context of Wabash today is that we can't romanticize how good we used to have it. We had it good when we saw each other on campus because each of you matters. And in that sense, nothing has changed. Each of you matters every bit as much on April 2nd as you did on February 1st. So community is kept alive when you spend your mental and spiritual energy not on waxing philosophic about how great it would be to get one last game or one last walk in the Arboretum or whatever else, but the spirit of Wabash is kept alive when you think of the needs of your brother and of the goods in your pocket or heart and mind, and you help the two of those to meet. No dreams of lofty, romanticized community, but the very earthy email of encouragement, the Zoom call of honesty, and the text message of solidarity. That's the stuff of real Wabash community. Lastly, there's the issue of what I'll call meaning it and mercy. One of the most interesting parts of the book is where Bonhoeffer talks about the practice of lectio divina. That's where each of the brothers was supposed to meditate for a long time over a certain portion of biblical reading, usually a psalm. The reading was repeated in a circle over and over and over again, and the brother was to try to appropriate these words, to make them his own, to understand what it meant in his life. And sometimes the answer was nothing. Quoting Bonhoeffer from Life Together, all who begin to pray the Psalms try to repeat them personally as their own prayer, but soon they come across passages that they feel they cannot pray as their own prayer. Like those about innocence, vengeance, or suffering. They do not desire to gain control over these words, and yet they realize that they cannot pray them. To simplify a complicated response, what Bonhoeffer basically says is, take it easy on yourself. Not every person has had every experience. There is more in our aspirations than there is in our personal histories. What this means to me in a time of Wabash spread around in these COVID-19 days is that mercy must abound. It is really hard to concentrate. Be merciful on yourself. I can't tell you how many times I started and then walked away from writing this talk. My own scholarship these days is as crappy as my homeschool teaching of my daughter's kindergarten math lessons. We're all doing the best we can. And we are doing the best we can if we're doing the best we can. It's hard to mean it when praying the Psalms. It's hard to mean it when writing an analysis of a poem that has nothing to do with a pandemic, or a poli-sci problem that has nothing to do with governments and public health. But let mercy abound, and let's trust in each other that we'll get through this together. Bonhoeffer is not like you or me. He was a genius. A PhD at 21, he was a saint. His jailers were converted to Christianity simply by observing how much dignity and integrity this prisoner had. And he was a martyr. He was killed for insisting that no earthly power could command unlimited obedience. But he washed dishes with his brothers at Finkenwalde. He cooked midnight munch with them as they studied. He cheered them on as they found their way in their professional and personal lives. So in these weird days of sheltering at home, I find myself very drawn to his vision of how you keep going with life together, even if we're apart. Thank you, and hang in there.
Thank you, Derek. One quick announcement. We ask that you continue to go online to the Wabash College calendar at www.wabash.edu/calendar for the latest updates regarding online events and activities such as Alumni Association virtual meetings, our future chapel talks, the annual awards chapel later this month, and the virtual commencement ceremony scheduled for later in May. Now, wherever you may be watching, we ask that you please rise and join in the singing of Old Wabash.
From the hills of Maine to the western plain, where the cotton is blowing, the gloomy shade of the northern pine and the light of the southern seas, there's a name, a lyric, a color we cheer wherever we find him blowing. Cheers for Christ, our longing shadows flame and praise it in song and story. We love to shine as the light lights our good old Wabash Hill. Our prayers are always on our lives, most of hearts and hearts and minds. To sing the praise and preach your day shall be the name before us. When college days are past,